The 23 oxygen-driven torpedoes were about halfway to the targets when suddenly one of them leapt upward, breaking the surface of the water and raising white, billowing waves of fluorescent spray which stood out in the dark of night like a lighted signboard. The enemy column saw it too, and made a rapid right turn, followed by another right turn, and our torpedoes missed completely. Admiral Ijuin watched impassively through his binoculars and said, "What an evasion, but at least we distracted them from the convoy." At 22:55 Sazanami released her 8 remaining torpedoes. The distance was still a difficult 7,000 meters, but the admiral did not care. The enemy reacted with another sharp turn to the right and again evaded all torpedoes. "All guns," Ijuin roared, "open fire." Sazanami and Hamikaze rushed precipitously toward the enemy with guns blazing. But, without searchlights, the guns were poorly aimed. Also, the distance was too great for the small 12.7 mm guns of our destroyers. Isokaze and Shigur raced forward but held fire, while the two opposing groups swiftly closed. It was 20:59 when I gave my next battle order, "Ready 4 torpedoes portside." The next moment Shigur was straddled by enemy shells which fell 20 to 40 meters from the ship, kicking up pillars of water and spray. Another barrage, seconds later, bracketed our ship even more closely, and the third just barely missed us. I craned my neck and strained my eyes for gun flashes which simply did not appear. I realized now that we were confronted with the enemy's new flashless powder we had all heard rumored about. That, combined with his radar-controlled guns, presented a formidable opposition. Forgetting my own plans for a torpedo attack, I ordered smoke and a zigzag course. Shigur weaved back and forth through the thickening smokescreen at her full 30 knots. But no matter which way we turned, shells kept falling around us every 6 or 7 seconds with breathtaking, uncanny tempo. Tension rose as we realized that any moment might bring a direct hit. My torpedo and gunnery officers were crying for permission to open fire, but I knew we must hold off until the most opportune moment. We held fire while the enemy shelling continued. The enemy ships were approaching on a bearing of 60 degrees. I wanted to launch torpedoes before opening gunfire because the guns would tend to spoil the accuracy of our torpedo launchings. Enemy salvos were falling so close that they splashed water in my face. When the enemy range had closed to 5,000 meters, I gave the word to launch and turn away. I watched the torpedoes speed on their way and, at the same time, waited for the feeling of Shigur's response to her helm, which was slow in coming. A salvo of enemy shells hit farther away, and then another close by. I called for gunfire and Shigur's hull quivered like a leaf with the first barrage. The din was deafening. While we continued to fire at the enemy and he at us, not a single shell hit our ship. As my ears adjusted to the roar and clatter of guns, I became aware that the masthead lookout was shouting. One torpedo hit the second enemy ship. Our guns are getting the range on the third. I could see no vestige of this through the smoke of battle, but the news brought cheers from the crew on deck. The next piece of news, the most surprising of the day, was from Hamikaze, whose radar had detected the approach of a powerful enemy force. Captain Toshio Miyazaki suggested retirement to the northwest. A message from Admiral Ijuin expressed his concurrence with Miyazaki's proposal. I immediately sent word of my complete agreement. We turned northwest at 2300. Followed by Isokaze. Sazanami and Hamikaze, moving together, also sped on a retirement course. Shells continued to fall about us for another 10 minutes. None hit Shigur, but Isokaze was less fortunate. She desperately launched 8 torpedoes at the pursuing enemy, who swerved to the right, evaded them, and continued on. Near misses on Isokaze at 2312 injured some of her crewmen and set small fires. Hamikaze was also slightly damaged, but Sazanami and Shigur were unscathed. This was the second straight battle for Shigur in which she and her crew had not received a scratch. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Niwa, who commanded the convoy, later told me that his barge crews and passengers enjoyed a grandstand view of the 8 destroyers in their running battle. The men applauded and cheered when they saw hits made on the American ships. The 20 barges, meanwhile, inched along the coast as the U.S. destroyers Nicholas, O'Bannon, Taylor, Chevalier were being lured seaward by our destroyers. The 400 troops had to spend the following daylight hours in the barges, nestled along the coast, but they were put ashore at Horaniu when night fell. The landing operation was an unquestioned success. By the same token, it must be concluded that Captain Thomas J. Ryan's destroyers failed and, in so doing, left some unexplained puzzles. His ships paralleled our course until 2321 and then made two 90-degree right turns to head back toward the convoy. Some reports say he gave up the chase because his ships could make only 30 knots against the 35-knot speed of the Japanese destroyers. Shigeru's maximum speed was 30 knots. With her poor rudder response at the time, I know that she and Isokaze were running at no more than 28 knots. Furthermore, the course of his column and my pair of ships, as checked by action reports of both sides, do not support his claim of having chased us. Captain Ryan's force did not even give determined chase to the barges of the convoy. It is said that his destroyers had spent all their ammunition, but they must still have had some machine gun bullets left, and that was all that would have been needed against the unarmed barges. As it was, only 2 of the barges were sunk, and no lives were lost in them. It may be that Ryan thought this was one of the familiar Tokyo Express runs in which the destroyers were serving as transports for the main portion of the landing troops. When we withdrew, he may have retired satisfied that he had successfully foiled our landing operation. During the battle, neither I nor any of my colleagues saw a single American torpedo. This puzzled us too, especially since this encounter came only 10 days after an epical U.S. torpedo victory in this same area. Ijuin said afterward, "I believe the enemy ships must have been cruisers, not destroyers, because they preferred to fight with guns at long range." The claim by Shigeru's lookout that one of our torpedoes had hit the enemy was never verified. It may have been an illusion. More likely it was an explosion, induced by a destroyer's wake. The somewhat half-hearted enemy maneuvers after the reported hit led me to believe this latter possibility. Ijuin, of noble birth and used to having his way, was in a buoyant mood. He would hear nothing of my doubts and skepticism. Accordingly, his report to Imperial headquarters said, "The outstanding destroyer of this force is Shigure, which sank an enemy cruiser by torpedo attack." The most criticized part of the entire action was the Japanese break-off, which was sparked by Hamikaze's radar detection of a powerful enemy force in the vicinity. There is only one explanation for Hamikaze's error in this regard. Japanese radar was so unreliable in those days. It must have mistaken our convoy of barges for a non-existent enemy fleet. Since the end of the war, one have observed strong American criticism of Ijuin for his withdrawal, forsaking the barges he was supposed to protect. Strangely, however, there seem to have been no voices raised against the U.S. commander for his failure to follow through in this action. It is my feeling that both commanders approached this action prejudiced and preoccupied. The August 7 debacle at Vella Gulf was obviously a strong influence on Ijuin, and Ryan had commanded one of the destroyer squadrons in the Kolombangara Battle of July 12. In that battle, one of his ships had been sunk and 3 others turned in a poor performance as an outnumbered Japanese force inflicted heavy damage. Historians and critics too often overlook the state of mind of the commanders in judging a military or naval action. Our 4 destroyers returned to Rabaul on August 18. Shigeru's proud and happy crew was given the next day off. In those days of high attrition, it was a real wonder for a destroyer to go through 2 battles in a row without a scratch. On our previous return there had been raised eyebrows that Shigure should be the sole Japanese survivor. This time no one could even suggest a doubt about her valor. Admiral Ijuin lunched with Captain Miyazaki and me at the officers' club. They praised Shigure's performance until I was pleased to the point of embarrassment. Ijuin noted how greatly Shigure had changed under my command, and he concluded, "I regret, Hara, that as a division commander you have had but a single ship, and that one much older than your Amatsukaze. But be patient. You will soon have other ships to command." Admiral Ijuin was a remarkably congenial and friendly person despite his noble rank of baron. Born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he had achieved a Navy-wide reputation as an excellent navigator. It was gratifying to know that a man of his ability and rank was interested in one's welfare. Rabaul was enjoying a comparative quiet spell from air raids, so we left the club after lunch and went for a stroll. A balmy southeasterly breeze rustled the coconut trees. There was little fuss about formalities at this tropical base. We wore plain shirts and shorts and ordinary straw hats. Accordingly, sailors passed us without saluting for a change, and it was fun to walk unnoticed. Stores conducted business as usual and most of them were owned by Chinese. What a tenacious people. While Japan and the Allies were engaged in savage battle, the calm Chinese of Rabaul seemed interested only in strengthening their control of the local economy. Passing an alleyway, we were attracted by a crowd gathered in an inner yard. The bystanders were watching the spirited dancing of some 40 native men. They wore nothing but feathers in their hair and colorful sarongs around their waists. The rest of their sepia bodies was covered with brightly hued powders and paints. With only drum for accompaniment, they danced so vigorously that they streamed with perspiration. From time to time, native women threw bananas or other fruit to the dancers. This was devoured while the dance continued. Occasionally they gave out loud shrieks which sounded like the quacking of ducks. We did not learn the occasion for this dance, but it was fascinating. For half an hour we watched as the young men kicked up their feet, waved arms, and jerked their heads from side to side. It was monotonous but strangely appealing. Miyazaki said, "These people are content with their primitive way of life, bare subsistence food, crude dwellings, coarse garments, and they seek nothing more. By our standards they are lazy. But who is happier?" Ijuan finally suggested a move, saying, "I enjoy this dancing, but would like to visit the hot spring baths we saw earlier. Will you join me?" This proposal took Miyazaki and me by surprise. We had visited the hot spring and commented in passing with the Admiral about what a good bath place it was. Now Miyazaki recovered voice before I did, and said, "Begging your pardon, sir, that spring is right out in the open. I have never seen an admiral bathing there." "But you have bathed there, my dear captain," Ijuan retorted, "and if you can enjoy the pleasures of the large outdoor bath, why should I have to be content with my narrow and uncomfortable shipboard bath?" There was no arguing with an admiral, especially when his words were so full of pleasant logic. Taking advantage of the volcanic formation of New Britain, the Navy had built open-air bath houses over the hot springs. Large metal drums in each enclosure served as tubs. Each bather filled his own with the clean, hot spring water. A rinsing wash, followed by a Japanese-style soaking in the tub, and the bather emerges lobster red and refreshed. It was the most popular place in Rabaul for ship's crews. Anyone with a shore pass could bathe free of charge, and, after days at sea with no bath, this was a welcome treat. But high-ranking officers had their own baths on board ship. Thus it was surprising for an admiral, let alone one who was also a baron, to visit these public baths. When we started to fill our drums with the hot water, 2 young men leapt from their tubs, saluted, and took over our work. We had returned their salutes automatically, but Ijuan quickly said, "Take it easy, lads. We can fill our own tubs. Stark naked, there is no difference of rank." But the young men would not listen. When the drums were filled, they disappeared. Ijuan sighed. We seemed to have spoiled their pleasure. I should not have come. The baths were wonderful. Before they were over, we had scrubbed each other's back, lined up in a row like 3 monkeys. It was most undignified for naval officers, but we did not care. In the course of this relaxation, Ijuan said, "Professor of Torpedoes Hara, I would like to have your critique of my action in this last operation. Sazanamis 8 fish were wasted. How could we have done better?" "Well, in the first place, I do not think they were really wasted. Our first spreads were detected when that one torpedo malfunctioned and broached. Had it not been for that, I believe we would have had some hits." Ijuan conceded that, and further mused that the distance had been too great for even our long-range torpedoes. I continued, "That's right. With the phenomenal success of the enemy's radar, I fear that all of my formulas will need adjustment. When the enemy can fire at us with the advantage of radar-controlled range finders, it is virtually impossible for us to close him to within 3,000 yards. "That is true," Ijuan said. "The enemy now has the upper hand, and it would be wiser for us not to try for a smashing victory every time. It does not pay to sink an enemy ship if it costs us too dearly in men and ships." The Allied offensive was growing constantly stronger, gaining momentum, and becoming more and more difficult to oppose. On the very day of our return, while we were relaxing at Rabaul, Japanese troops started a withdrawal from Santa Isabel, a long, slender Solomon's Island due east of and parallel to the islands of Vella Lavella, Kolombangara, and New Georgia. We had 3 days rest at Rabaul before Miyazaki and I were ordered to take 3 destroyers and pick up as many troops as possible from Ricotta on northeastern Santa Isabel. Of 3,400 troops at Rakata, some 600 had been removed by an earlier group of destroyers. Once again Shigur was teamed with Hamikaze. Damaged Isokaze was replaced by Minazuki and the 3 ships sortied in the morning of August 22. We were loaded to capacity with food and supplies for those who could not be evacuated. Our 3 ships could each carry only 250 passengers. Our mission was a tough one under any circumstances. The previous evacuation, carried off just 4 days earlier, made our task all the more difficult. The enemy was alerted. We had to be prepared for the worst. The approach to Rakata was dangerous because of its countless unposted reefs and shoals. Our charts, copied from British ones made in 1939, carried this note: these islands have been only partially surveyed and, the larger portion of them being quite unknown, great caution is necessary while navigating in this vicinity. We were not 100 miles out of Rabaul when 3 enemy planes flew over at 20,000 feet. Our guns fired at them immediately, but could not reach that altitude. It was most distressing. The enemy planes dropped no bombs, but they harassed us almost as effectively by circling overhead, out of reach, in taunting fashion. After about 10 minutes 60 fighters from Buka appeared on the scene. They climbed frantically to attack the bombers and made a number of firing passes. But the enemy planes, which appeared to be B-24s, kept on going, completely unperturbed. Our gunners rotated their guns skyward, ready to shoot if the enemy planes came within reach. But they went away after mocking our ships and planes for an exasperating 20 minutes. Our own planes continued southward with us until nightfall, when they returned to base. Uneasy hours followed then, as we had to maintain our own alert. Fortunately, no more enemy planes came. We advanced slowly along the Bougainville coast, fully realizing the risk we ran in these dangerous waters. We were stealthily nearing the jutting rocks and shoals around Choiseul when an urgent radio message came from Rakata. None of us who heard it will ever forget that message. 4 enemy cruisers and several destroyers sighted near the mouth of Rakata harbor. I groaned. Our heavy-laden ships, hampered by the dangerous reefs, had been making only 10 knots. In our close approach to Rakata we were supposed to slow to 6 knots. That would set us up like big clay pigeons for the shells and torpedoes of the enemy. While we struggled over the various possibilities, Hamikaze's veiled signal lamp blinked a message. Put about at once and head out to sea at 24 knots, until we learn the movements of the enemy. Our consequent turn away from the coast to head toward the north made us a clear target for the radar of the enemy. We had not been on our new course more than 10 minutes when a radio intercept indicated that an enemy scout plane had spotted and reported our change of course. What could we do against such an opponent? A study of the chart showed the enemy to be just 30 miles distant. Should we hug the island coast to confuse his radar? Make a run for it. Attack. By attacking we could surely knock out an enemy ship or 2, but there was no chance of defeating all the enemy ships. The blue signal lamp in Hamikaze's stern began to blink. Rabaul orders immediate return to base without engaging. Return to Rabaul at 30 knots. I breathed a deep sigh of relief and looked at my watch. It was almost midnight as we headed toward Rabaul, where we arrived in the afternoon of August 23. We barely had time to recover lost sleep when 2 days later we left again for Rakata. This time we got a break with murky weather which kept us from being spotted by the enemy. There was intermittent rain during our southward run and visibility was down to a few hundred meters by nightfall. Weather conditions were the same when we arrived at Santa Isabel. We now wished, since there was no sign of enemy warships, that the weather would clear. We slowed to 6 knots and threaded the reefs of Rakata harbor at this snail's pace, pausing every 100 meters to check on our situation. This was as enervating as enemy action. We groped thus for almost 2 hours, until a dim light appeared. It was a garrison soldier, marking the harbor mouth. Our 3 ships had successfully negotiated the treacherous shoals, and we were relieved to ease into the narrow port. By 1 of August 25 we had started to unload cargo. Several hundred troops waited on the blacked-out pier for their time to embark. The silence of the night was suddenly and violently shattered by 2 bomber planes, which roared in at masthead height and zoomed away into the low-hanging clouds. In the same instant their bombs began to detonate, raising huge pillars of water all around. A quick survey showed no damage, but the poorly aimed bombs did serve to speed up the unloading process. As the decks were cleared of cargo, the waiting troops flew up the ramps. The ships were soon jammed with eager passengers and we were on our way again. It was still pitch dark, but now we could navigate the reefs without pausing. As soon as we sighted the signal light at the mouth of the harbor, we gained speed. By 2:30 we were up to 30 knots, certain the enemy planes would soon be after us again, and in greater numbers. We wanted to be as far away as possible by daybreak. Dawn came within an hour of our reaching the open sea. We were then running along the coast of Choiseul. Another hour passed and we reached Bougainville Strait, and so did the enemy planes. Luckily we spotted their approach and were able to put up a smokescreen as we scattered. Hamikaze and Minazuki revved up to their maximum of 35 knots. Shiger panted along at her best speed of 30. There were at least a dozen enemy planes and they seemed to be everywhere. They swooped and banked all around us. Our guns roared skyward ceaselessly, but made no effective hits. We zigzagged and weaved at top speed as the bombs came curving down, but Shiger was exasperatingly sluggish in responding to the helm. An intense 5 minutes passed and the planes were gone. Fortunately for Shiger, the bombardiers did not have her number. The various ship sections reported no damage or casualties. No bombs had even come close. As we were clearing our own smokescreen, the two other destroyers showed up some 3,000 meters ahead. When all smoke had cleared, I saw that Hamikaze was in trouble. There was fire in her forecastle and she was limping at greatly reduced speed. Minazuki appeared to be intact and was standing by. Shiger closed quickly while Hamikaze sent us a flag signal. One direct hit on forecastle, 36 casualties. Speed restricted to 20 knots. And considering heading for Shortland. Miyazaki. Our nearest base was at Shortland, not more than 30 miles away. But I knew it was not safe for warships because no air cover was available. Accordingly, my signalman waved a message. Captain Hara strongly objects to your plan. Shortland base no longer safe. Let us return to Rabaul at 20 knots. If trouble develops, Shiger is prepared to tow you. Please reply. Miyazaki promptly approved my suggestion. Hamikaze's fire was put out and we continued northward together. The rest of the voyage was agonizingly slow, but luckily no more planes came to attack, and we made it to Rabaul. Waterfront hands gaped to see Shiger heading the column composed of Hamikaze and Minazuki. If any of these three should have been a victim, it was rickety old Shiger and not a new, fast ship like Hamikaze. Every man in Shiger was happy and proud. We had not forgotten the jibes and jokes aimed at her in the past. I felt sorry for Miyazaki when we met the next day at headquarters. After an excellent career and brilliant performances as a destroyerman, he had been directly in line for promotion to flag rank while still in his 40s. Now, as hapless commander of a destroyer division whose every ship was under repair from battle damage, his chances of making admiral seemed much more remote. This day he was sullen and shamefaced. Ijuin greeted him by holding out a piece of paper and saying, "Don't scowl, Miyazaki. Read this and cheer up." His hands trembled as he read the paper and passed it to me with a wan smile. It was a radio message from Shortland saying that the base was being ruthlessly pounded by a heavy air attack. Miyazaki shook my hand and said, "Hara, you saved me and Hamikaze with her crew and hundreds of passengers. Had I gone to Shortland we would have been blasted to bits by now." 4 days later Admiral Ijuin summoned me and Shiger's skipper to his office. Our squadron commander appeared moody and spoke somewhat hesitatingly. "Shiger is to make a solo transport run to Tulu Vu. I hate to give you this assignment, but I have been ordered to take all our other destroyers with me to evacuate Ricotta. Shiger has been chosen for the lone mission because we know that you are on board, Hara, and we believe that if any man can make this run with a single ship, you can. It is a difficult assignment, and I promise that at least one more destroyer will be added to your division when you return from this mission. I am flattered, Admiral Ijuin, to be given this assignment. It is a matter of great honor for Yamagami and me to take Shiger on this lone sortie." Ijuin's face brightened with relief. In sudden good humor he spoke again. "Hara, you have worked wonders with Shiger. She has earned a nickname in the fleet as the indestructible destroyer. I am proud to have her in this command, and I hope we can sortie together the next time." At Tulu Vu, on the northern tip of New Britain's Cape Gloucester, Japan maintained a small airbase. Although the enemy now held air superiority in this vicinity, Tulu Vu was important as an advance lookout post for Rabaul. There was no overland route between Rabaul and Tulu Vu, so all supplies had to be brought in by ship. Food and ammunition had been in short supply at this little base for some time, but its repeated requests for supplies had gone unanswered because of the pressure of the Solomons' operations. Now Tulu Vu could no longer be ignored if Japan wanted to keep it. The name had an ominous sound for me. Tulu Vu sits at the western mouth of the Bismarck Sea where, in early March, the enemy had introduced skip bombing to sink 4 of 8 destroyers and 8 out of 8 transports, from our 16-ship convoy. It was off Tulu Vu that Ariake of my own division sank on July 28, along with Mikazuki. The 2 destroyers had run aground on a reef while dodging enemy bombs. Tulu Vu was fully within range of daily Allied air patrols. Any Japanese ship venturing in those waters could expect enemy bombers to provide an all-out welcome, including their phenomenal skip bombing. Try as I had for a defensive solution against this form of attack, here we were, almost certain to face it, and I still had no idea of how skip bombing could be thwarted. Bismarck Sea survivors had reported how ineffective conventional evasive tactics had proven to be. Perhaps if the target ship turned directly toward the attacker, the plane's timing would be thrown off. But there was no way to find out except by the test of battle. And that involved the lives of my ship and its crew of more than 200 men. Shiger left Rabaul at noon, September 1st, on her sortie for Tulu Vu. At 18 knots we moved along New Britain's northern coast, as treacherous as any in the Solomons. Here also were many uncharted rocks and shoals. Night came as we approached Cape Holman, at the northern tip of Willaoun's Peninsula, roughly midway between Rabaul and Tulu Vu. Shiger was entering the danger zone. The radio room announced that an enemy plane was transmitting from nearby. This news came a little earlier than anticipated. I ordered the lookouts to watch for enemy planes, despite the heavy clouds and darkness. An hour later the radioman called out, "An enemy plane is sending again. Directly overhead." We cannot decipher the message, but it seems to refer to our position, direction, and speed. The weather and visibility worsened as we continued westward. It was becoming sultry. Sweat stood in beads on my face. Minutes passed and the radio room called, "An enemy plane is again reading our course." Tension and silence mounted on the bridge. I took out a handkerchief and wiped my face. Never had the atmosphere been so tense. Lieutenant Tsukihara, the navigation officer, observed approaching rain, and he was right. It came, cutting visibility to a few meters. It was 20 hours. We dropped speed and turned southwest for an approach to the craggy coast. The radio room reported that no enemy planes were audible. "Good," said Tsukihara. "This glorious weather has discouraged the enemy." The tension on the bridge was easing. Officers and men chattered in whispers. They yawned and stretched when 20 minutes had passed with no enemy communications detected in the vicinity. Arms froze in the air and jaws fell agape, however, at the sudden high-pitched, jarring sound of dive-bombing planes. We all crouched and ducked. With a spine-shivering roar, a plane whizzed directly over the bridge. There was a monstrous, deafening detonation followed by several explosions. Another plane thundered by the mast. I staggered to my feet. Where were the enemy planes? I saw Yamagami grope for and press the warning button, and klaxons whined their belated warning of an air attack throughout the ship. Shiger was swinging sharply to port when a water pillar rose within her turning circle, not more than 10 meters from the ship. It cascaded smack onto the forecastle. The bridge was inundated. Shaking off the water I shouted, "Hard right rudder. Immediate overboost, flank speed." Tsukihara looked at me incredulously and said, "Flank speed with immediate overboost." "Immediately," I roared. Pale and trembling, Tsukihara pushed the engine room communicator lever full to the bottom, and closed his eyes. At the same time Yamagami called into the engine room voice tube for an immediate overboost, and mumbled, "Oh God." Their reactions were perfectly natural. I had never before given such an order. Most naval officers go through their careers without ever giving such an order. Under normal conditions, it requires half an hour to go from a cruising speed of 12 knots to a maximum speed of 30. Under combat conditions this kind of speed increase should take 15 minutes. My immediate order ignored all normal procedures, and ran the risk of breaking turbines and engines of our venerable Shiger. This caused a flurry below decks that is hard to imagine. The greatest anxiety of the engine room gang was that this sudden call for power might shatter the fins of the turbine as the engine valves were opened. All hands performed their emergency duties, as ordered, in full expectation that this would happen. Everyone on the bridge awaited the momentary appearance of more enemy planes. Yamagami, who was looking toward the stern, suddenly shouted and pointed toward the stack which was belching long steady streams of flame. The excess fuel poured on was being burned in the funnel, whence the flames ominously illuminated the entire after part of the ship. Bombers could never miss such a target. Anxious minutes passed. They seemed like hours, and then the radio room voice pipe boomed. Enemy plane, in plain language, reports direct hits amidship on a destroyer, setting it afire and leaving it sinking. Unable to believe my ears, I asked for a slow repeat of this message. Yamagami and Tsukihara shouted with joy when they heard the amazing report. Another voice broke through the hilarity as the engine room asked if the emergency overboost was to continue. I was delighted to reply that it was no longer needed, and that we could slow to 12 knots again. The flames from the stack subsided quickly, and we continued in the safety of darkness. No more planes came after us. The enemy had ridden off Shigur. The rest of our voyage was easy and pleasant, after our hair-raising experience. We landed supplies at Tulu Vu and left amid joyful cheers from the garrison. Again we returned undamaged to Rabaul. There I met Ijuin next day. He had got back safely and successfully from his regatta operation. When I told of our experience he laughed until he almost choked, and said, "I guess we can now call you the miracle captain, Hara. No one but you could have thought of such an unconventional and successful tactic on the spur of the moment." I was pleased at his considerateness, and said, "War does seem to involve many illusions. Luck had a large part in this one. I doubt that the same ruse will work again." As soon as Admiral Ijuin read my report of the Tulu Vu mission, he ordered a complete check and inspection of my ship. As a navigation expert, he was concerned about the effects on Shigur of the instant overboost she had experienced. After a test run and rigid check, the maintenance engineers submitted a report which fully justified Ijuin's apprehensions. The destroyer was declared unfit for combat. The report noted that an overhaul was long past due. The engine was on the point of breaking down. The ship did not respond properly to helm and rudder. The hull was heavily encrusted with barnacles, and all precision machinery was badly in need of repair and adjustment. The report concluded, "It is recommended that all possible repairs be made at Rabaul so that Shigur may proceed to Sasebo for complete overhaul at earliest opportunity." When a copy of the report reached Shigur, it was circulated through the ship. Reactions of the crew were varied but basically the same. Not a man wanted to go home. After repeated battles without loss of a life, morale in this ship was at the peak, and the men roared in anger at the report. They booed, cursed, shook their fists, and howled threats at the fathead mechanics. Admiral Ijuin, of course, approved the engineers' recommendations. When the repairmen came on board, the crew's attitude quickly changed. They became all sweetness and light, offering to cooperate with the workmen in every way. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kainuma, Shigur's chief engineer, was particularly effective. A foot-long beard gave him the fierce appearance of a caveman, but he was shrewd and intelligent, in addition to being one of the ship's heaviest drinkers. Kainuma befriended the repair foremen, bought them drinks each day, tried to cajole them into making a new recommendation for Shigur. "Rabaul is short of warships," he pleaded. "Even this rickety old tub is in better shape than ones which have received direct hits. We want to fight. Give us an early chance to sink enemy ships." Such was the general attitude of my crew. How they had changed in the last 6 months. I was now proud of them, knowing that they could succeed in any battle with their fine spirit. The repair job took much longer than anticipated. There were additional defects which needed the repair crew's attention. During our first week of enforced idleness, I fell sick. Throughout the active month of August, we never had more than a brief rest between strenuous battles which entailed long, nerve-wracking hours and many sleepless nights. In such rest periods as we had, I took to drinking heavily before retiring. By the end of August, the first was consuming almost a gallon of sake to get to sleep. After a week of idleness and drinking, I had fears of becoming an alcoholic, and tried to cut down. I developed a terrible case of nerves, Not serious enough to confine me to bed but enough to make me moody and irascible. I brooded about the war situation. Why did not Japanese statesmen negotiate for peace before it was too late? I could not sleep well. When I did sleep it was only to have bad dreams and awaken in a cold sweat. Looking back on this period, I am grateful for Ijua's awareness of my need for rest. I was still strong, in my early 40s, and yet command of a ship in wartime was a grueling task. I can only imagine how much more difficult it must have been for higher-ranking officers. Historians, often critical of commanding officers, are apt to overlook the strains and heavy responsibilities of a battle command. My brief rest was a lifesaver. Those 2 weeks of recuperation saved me from having a nervous breakdown. By the time our repair job was finished in mid-September, I was fully back in form, physically and mentally. Meanwhile, the war situation for Japan had deteriorated. Lines of communication were being cut and outpost garrisons were being strangled. Accordingly, the High Command decided on another withdrawal operation. The Kolombangara area was to be evacuated. I returned to action just in time for the Buka transport operation. This Solomon Island is the closest of that group to Rabaul. Ijuan had decided that this easy operation would provide a good warm-up for me. The Kolombangara pullout began September 21st. On that date the Japanese contingents were withdrawn from Arundel and Gizo, which flanked Kolombangara on the south and southwest. On the 27th, the Buka operation completed, I joined in the evacuation of the 10,000-man garrison from Kolombangara itself. This job was successfully completed in early October with a loss of only 66 men. Vella Lavella was next on the program. From there, as from the other evacuation points, the troops were pulled back to assemble at Bougainville. Ijuan was ordered to direct the evacuation of some 600 troops from Horaniu, Vella Lavella. For this withdrawal operation Ijuan mapped out an elaborate plan calling for 3 support groups of 9 destroyers. Compared with the total of only 25 destroyers used in evacuating 10,000 troops from Kolombangara, this was an extraordinarily strong force. Ijuan explained that though the Kolombangara operations had met with surprisingly little opposition, the enemy was now aware of our strategy, and we had to be ready for much stronger opposition. The ludicrous character of this particular operation is highlighted by the fact that the 600 troops on Horaniu were to be transported to Bin in southern Bougainville, a distance of no more than 50 miles. Furthermore, and ironically, 400 of these soldiers comprised the group whose landing on Horaniu had been supported by Ijuan just a month and a half earlier. The resultant destroyer battle of October 6-7 was one of the most confused encounters of the Pacific War. From the very beginning, the fight was conducted by men consistently obsessed with illusions and miscalculations, but some points are certain. The Americans had a correct appraisal of Japanese strength at Horaniu, and they were aware that an effort to withdraw these few isolated troops was imminent. The enemy also knew that a year of attrition warfare had seriously depleted Japanese surface strength. But the American High Command did not dream that the Japanese Navy would throw 9 destroyers, 4 sub-chasers, and 20 barges into such a small operation. Admiral Ijuan had been through many naval actions in recent months. He was a tired man. While I was able to recover from my weariness, he had no chance to rest from the mental and physical strain of protracted battle. This was an important factor in the ensuing engagement. Ijuan led the force in destroyer Akigumo, followed by experienced Captain Miyazaki and his Isokazi and the rest. Had Ijuan sailed in Isokazi, he could have relied on Miyazaki to assist in making important battle decisions. In Akigumo, with her less experienced captain and officers, Ijuan was forced to make all decisions for himself. Contrary to the opinions of some Americans concerning this action, Ijuan was ready and willing to fight. The very number of ships he brought attests to that. Being a navigation expert, he was inclined toward elaborate maneuvers, and the memory of having successfully outmaneuvered the enemy in the same area 7 weeks earlier could not but influence him further. Tired as he was, new concepts could not be expected. The 4 ships of his first group were capable of making 35 knots. Accordingly, in our conference on tactics, Ijuan had told us that he would maneuver to lure the enemy into position where my 2 destroyers could make a disconcerting thrust so that the third group of destroyers could reach the transport convoy without opposition. Our 9 destroyers were thus deployed in separate groups to confuse the enemy as to our actual strength. The Americans did underestimate our total fighting strength, but they did not fight according to Ijuin's script. The day was cloudy with intermittent rain. We found comfort in the squalls, which provided a measure of concealment. We were skirting the eastern coast of Bougainville at noon when our radios picked up an enciphered enemy message. It came from either a patrol plane or from some clandestine lookout planted in the Bougainville jungle. We had no way of knowing if the spotter was reporting all or just some of our ships, then spread over many miles in their 3 separate groups, but it was disconcerting to know that our presence had been detected so early. On receipt of this message, distance between our ships was increased from 500 to 1,000 meters in preparation for an air assault. Several planes did approach from the direction of Choiseul about 1,500, just as we encountered heavy rain squalls. The storms provided welcome protective darkness for half an hour or so, in which time the planes gave up the chase. When we emerged into clear weather, they were nowhere to be seen. At sunset I received a message from Ijuin saying that his group was rushing ahead toward Vella Lavella, and directing the rest of us to slow to 9 knots and stand by east of Shortland to meet the barges which were expected to come out soon. Ijuin thereupon sped down Bougainville Strait with his 4 ships at 26 knots. Darkness added considerably to the hazard of these waters, but his ships made it without incident. It was a fine demonstration of his talent as a navigator. My 2 ships moved slowly through the strait and met the transport convoy east of Shortland on schedule. We then proceeded southeast at a leisurely 9 knots. Ijuin had arrived almost at Horaniu when he spotted 4 destroyers through the darkness. A sudden rain squall cloaked everything from sight, this time favoring the enemy, who had not yet sighted Ijuin. Groping in the utter darkness, and preoccupied with dire thoughts about the enemy's radar-controlled guns, Ijuin hesitated. At that moment he was handed a message from the radio room. A scout plane from Rabaul has spotted 4 enemy cruisers and 3 destroyers cruising westward north of Vella Lavella. Ijuin nodded gravely and quietly gave the order for his group to be ready to reverse course. This completely erroneous sighting report thus caused most of the ensuing Japanese blunders. How it came to be credited and disseminated has never been determined. It is my assumption that the scout pilot was sadly lacking in experience. He probably saw the group of 3 American destroyers intermittently through the clouds. Seeing them in various positions and on various courses, he could easily have mistaken the one group for 2 or 3 different ones, and he so reported. It was a grave error indeed. Had this first sighting report been accurate, the entire picture of the battle would have been different. A cruiser packs 10 times the firepower of a destroyer, and Ijuin must have been thinking of this and recalling how accurate radar-controlled guns can be. Ijuin knew that in rain and darkness, without effective radar, his warships would be no match for so powerful an enemy force. He could thus come to only one decision. When the fateful message came to Shigur, I was surprised at the early appearance of the enemy but had no reason to doubt the accuracy of the sighting report. I could fairly visualize Ijuin's chagrin at thus having his schedule disturbed. His dilemma was a harsh one. Should he follow the logical choice of canceling the entire show, or should he try to continue as planned? His force was disproportionately strong for the minor evacuation effort on which he was embarked. Cancellation would mean a terrible loss of face. Also, here was no reason to think that postponement of the evacuation attempt would result in meeting a lesser enemy force the next time. While Ijuin wavered, debating the various possibilities, his group of ships continued southward at 26 knots. And while he wavered, Captain Walker, leading a column of 3 destroyers in flagship Selfridge, spotted what he determined to be an enemy transport convoy at 21:31. While Walker ordered his own ships to race toward the convoy at 33 knots, he called in another group of 3 U.S. destroyers which were then off the northern coast of New Georgia, some 20 miles west of his position. Visibility this night was variable and changing. Clear air brought objects into view from a range of up to 15,000 meters. But frequent mists and vapors reduced local visibility to practically zero. Thus it was that Captain Walker had sighted Japanese ships from afar, while Ijuin was still unaware of these American destroyers. Walker's ships were closing rapidly on the Japanese destroyers when Ijuin issued his next order, which was for my 2 destroyers to join him as quickly as possible. I received this message at 2010, and hastened to comply by ordering our full speed of 30 knots. Ijuin was then still ignorant of the enemy's location and movements. This rapidly closing threat was hidden from him by the hazy night air. But, trying to facilitate the joinder of my ships, Aijuan turned his group westward at 2029. 6 minutes later I radioed an appeal. Cannot find you because of poor visibility. Request that Yugumo hoist a blue stern light. At this time, 2035, Aijuan put his ships into a sharp left turn as Yugumo hoisted the requested identification lamp. Aijuan's column took 2 more left turns in rapid succession, the last at 2038, when I caught sight of the blue signal light. 1 minute later Aijuan finally sighted the enemy column approaching from the east. The 4 fast Japanese destroyers picked up to 35 knots and sped southward. The night's misty vapors hindered visibility as Aijuan squinted and glowered at the enemy column, which he still believed to consist of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Through the haze he estimated the range of the wraith-like enemy ships to be 10,000 meters, and he decided to repeat his tactics of August 17. He planned, accordingly, to head west-southwest at high speed for a torpedo-firing run. But, as is so often true at sea, these targets appeared to be closer than in fact they were, and Aijuan misjudged the distance. He dashed briefly to the south-southwest, on course 235 degrees, altered at 2040 to south by west.